Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 60. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 117 and 118 of the Prima Pars, that is, of things pertaining to the action of man and of the production of man from man as to the soul. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether one man can teach another as being the cause of his knowledge. The insights from this article are surprisingly profound, I would say. Am I able to teach the listener of this podcast? In one way, yes, but in another way, no. I can teach in the sense of breaking abstract ideas into sensible pieces or analogies or parables for the learner to, God willing, more easily abstract or grasp the deeper, simpler idea behind or underneath them. But when it comes to the act of learning, that must happen in the learner. It is not something I can, of my own volition, affect in another. The person listening to this podcast must themselves undertake the actual act of abstracting from my words and images the deeper ideas. So in one way I can teach another by giving examples and breaking apart concepts, but ultimately the act of understanding can come from nowhere but from the listener, the learner, themselves. Kind of like how the doctor bestows health, not by healing you, strictly speaking, because your own body must do that, but by providing the remedies to enable or expedite your very own healing process. In St. Thomas's words, the teacher only brings exterior help as the physician who heals, but just as the interior nature is the principal cause of the healing, so the interior light of the intellect is the principal cause of knowledge. Aquinas will then describe the 2 ways in which the teacher teaches or assists the learner in his or her learning. The first is by leading the learner from general premises down to the necessary conclusions for those who cannot at first see the inevitable conclusions which flow from an original premise. For example, leading someone from their own experience of conceptual thought, whether as pertaining to philosophy, science, or religion, to the inevitable conclusion that such thought presupposes the existence of the immaterial mind in us. The second manner of teaching would be by breaking up the broader, simpler, more universal notion into smaller, more digestible pieces, leading one from the less universally applicable idea to the more universal. Like, take, for example, the notion that man's intellect is immaterial, and then moving from that point to the simpler, more universal proposition that any and everywhere, whether it be man, angels, or God, intelligence requires immateriality within the knower. The third way of teaching would be by use of analogy or parable, by presenting sensible examples so as to allow the learner to more easily grasp the general abstract universal. For example, using light and darkness as a sensible analogy for good and evil, for just as darkness has no existence in itself, neither does evil. One is an absence of light, the other is an absence of goodness. Lastly, since it is by a natural light we are able to understand at all, God or another immaterial spirit by God's permission can help strengthen that faculty. In this way, angels can also be called our teachers, as we mentioned in episode 57. Article 2, whether man can teach the angels. St. Thomas responds to this article briefly, writing, superior angels are never enlightened by inferior angels. Now it is manifested in the same way as inferior angels are subject to the superior, the highest men are subject even to the lowest angels. Therefore, angels are never enlightened by men concerning divine things, but men can by means of speech make known to angels the thoughts of their heart, because it belongs to God alone to know the heart's secrets. Article 3, whether man by the power of his soul can change corporeal matter. Could a man, by means of his soul, turn water into its constitutive parts, hydrogen and oxygen, through the process we call electrolysis? And the answer, as we know from experience, is no. We can affect the matter that our soul is informing via our soul, our body. But if we want to split water, we're going to have to affect that water physically. And the same goes for angels. Only God, as the author of both matter and form, can change it immediately and without some physical influence on it. St. Thomas says, the angels cannot change corporeal matter by their natural power except by employing corporeal agents for the production of certain effects. Much less, therefore, can the soul by its natural power change corporeal matter except by means of bodies. Article 4, whether the separate human soul can move bodies, at least locally. After one dies and the soul ceases to inform one's body, can the soul still affect things in the material world, at least by moving them like pushing a chair? St. Thomas says no, and the basis for his argument is taken from common experience, like how amputated limbs are no longer able to be influenced by our soul, nor dead bodies. In his words, for it is manifest that even while the soul is united to the body, it does not move the body except as endowed with life, so that if one of the members becomes lifeless, it does not obey the soul as to local motion. Now it is also manifest that no body is quickened by the separate soul. Therefore, within the limits of its natural power, the separate soul cannot command the obedience of a body, though by the power of God it can exceed those limits. And so, of course, God could grant the miraculous to disembodied souls, allowing them to continue influencing the material world after death, like Samuel speaking with Saul after dying. That's 1 Samuel chapter 28. But the question here is limited to the natural, not the supernatural. And with that, we move to question 118 of the production of man, from man as to the soul. Article 1, whether the sensitive soul is transmitted with the semen. This is a question of how animal reproduction works out, and it is a prelude for what will follow it, human procreation. If you remember, Aquinas and Aristotle used the term soul more broadly than we do today. If you were to overhear someone at the coffee shop talking about the soul today, in the 21st century, they're likely using the word to mean that aspect of us which continues after death. But anything that is a living, or is its own principle of motion, Aristotle and Aquinas will call ensouled. For as we said in episode 39, Aristotle defines the soul as the act of a body having life potentially. Having life here meaning having the potential to move itself. So if animals are informed matter, like every other actually existing material thing, and the form of living things we call the soul, then in this article we are asking how the sensible or able to sense creature, namely animals, receive their soul. Aquinas responds by distinguishing the instrumental cause of animal reproduction being the reproductive faculties and the principal cause, which is the form or sensitive soul of the animal. In his words, and as it matters not whether we say that something is moved by the instrument or by the principal agent, so neither does it matter whether we say that the soul of the generated is caused by the soul of the generator or by some seminal power derived therefrom. Article 2, whether the intellectual soul is produced from the semen. And forgive me for the crass terms in these articles. I am just reading what is written in my translation. If in the last article we discussed that the animal or sensitive soul is derived from the form and matter of its previous animal, what about us, the intellectual animal? Where does our rational soul come from? St. Thomas responds, it is impossible for an active power existing in matter to extend its action to the production of an immaterial effect. Now it is manifest that the intellectual principle in man transcends matter, for it has an operation in which the body takes no part whatsoever. It is therefore impossible for the seminal power to produce the intellectual principle. Since the intellectual soul has an operation independent of the body, it is subsistent. Moreover, since it is an immaterial substance, it cannot be caused through generation, but only through the creation by God. And for proof of the subsistent immaterial existence of the rational soul, I would check out episodes 39 through 41 of this podcast. So God must inform the material provided by our father and mother in order to form a human being in the womb of our mother at the moment of conception. And for how that works out, Aquinas writes, "Where there are many agents ordered to one another, nothing hinders the power of the higher agent from reaching to the ultimate form, while the powers of the inferior agents extend only to some disposition of matter. Thus, in the generation of an animal, the seminal power disposes the matter, but the power of the soul gives the form. Now, the whole of corporeal nature acts as the instrument of a spiritual power, especially of God. Therefore, nothing hinders the formation of the body from being due to a corporeal power, while the intellectual soul is from God alone." It is complicated, to say the least, which reminds me of the mother of 7 Maccabean sons who says, in beholding this mystery of human conception, especially as it relates to God, in 2 Maccabees chapter 7, "I do not know how you came into being in my womb. It was not I who gave you life and breath, nor I who set in order the elements within each of you." Mysterious, but as Aquinas seeks to show, not contrary to reason. And so on to our last article, whether human souls were created together at the beginning of the world. Were human souls created along with the angels before the material universe was made? And although I think there are some religious groups that hold this position and even some philosophical schools, it just doesn't square with reason. We are not angels. We cannot think naturally without having recourse to the body. We cannot receive information naturally without the senses. And for an intelligent creator to create disembodied souls existing in an estranged, unnatural state would just not be intelligent. God is all good, all powerful, all knowing, and since it is contrary to his prudence, to his goodness, to create a thing from the outset in an estranged state, we must reject it as a possibility. St. Thomas Aquinas will argue in the following way: "But if some say that it is not natural to the soul to be united to the body, he must give the reason why it is united to a body. And the reason must be either because the soul so willed or for some other reason. If because the soul willed it, this seems incongruous, because it would be unreasonable of the soul to wish to be united to the body if it did not need the body. For if it did need it, it would be natural for it to be united to it. And if this union be neither voluntary nor natural on the part of the soul, then it must be the result of some violent cause, and to the soul would have something of a penial or an afflicting nature." And so St. Thomas concludes, "Since therefore all these opinions are unreasonable, we must simply confess that souls were not created before bodies, but are created at the same time as they are infused into them." And that is all for questions 117 and 118 of the Prima Pars, that is, of things pertaining to the action of man and of the production of man from man as to the soul. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.